So tomorrow's another election. Let's try and get a handle on what's going on. I just want to look at the, we're in our fourth election now. I want to look at the few behind us. So just this whole thing of, I'm sure if you've been following Israeli politics in the last few years, the whole issue of left and right has become very confusing. And what I've done here in terms of red and blue is to suggest some kind of ideology. What basically the ideology is kind of left and right, but it's not political reality. And I'll try and explain what I mean by that. Just to remind you of the main political parties, many of them have changed since you were at HUC. So we have Likud, Shas, which is the Sephardi Haredi party, Yisrael Beitenu, which is Yvette Lieberman, to a large extent, the Russian-speaking party, but not only. UTJ, Yadut HaTorah, the Ashkenazi Haredi party, and Yamina, which in the old days used to be the National Religious Party. It at that time had Ayelet Shaked as the head, but now it's Naftali Bennett. So they're all right of center in a certain sense, although we're not even sure what the terms mean anymore. Then you have on the other side, Kahol Lavan, blue and white, with Gantz, this tall guy you see over here, who's been a political failure and in some ways is responsible for some of the things that have gone wrong. The joint list is the Arab combination of three Arab factions came together for the last few elections, but now they're in crisis. I'll talk about it a little later. Ayman Odeh, he's a very capable guy. Then in September 2019, there was a combination of Labour and Gesher. Gesher was a one-person woman who came in and they got 6 seats. Then there was what was called the Democratic Union, which is essentially Meretz, and they got 5 seats. Altogether, we see September 2019, the right is stronger than the left, if we're using that terminology. March 2020, we look at what's happening, essentially the same, a little bit back and forward, but the big changes, Kahol Lavan split in 3 directions. So myself included, I voted for Gantz. I voted for blue and white. Many of us did, hoping that he would be able to control Bibi, Benjamin Netanyahu. But he couldn't. The party split. And it went back to what it originally was. Blue and white is the new section. Yair Lapid is Lapid, Yesh Atid is the other section. And the Labour Gesher Meretz combination, which had existed just for the one election, split also. By the way, that's not unusual. As you might remember, parties split and come together all the time. It wasn't worse than in the past, but it caused political chaos. Just to try and look at the last 3 elections in the nutshell. So if we look at Likud over the last 3 elections, before tomorrow, obviously, low figures. There was one election in the 1950s where the Labour Party got 56 seats, but the large parties are small. And one of the problems of Israeli politics at the moment is that it's not nowhere near a 2-party system. I mean, we used to kind of think that would be the case in Israel, but it really didn't happen. And what we're having now, and I'm sure many of you are aware of it, is the unbelievable power of the ultra-Orthodox, of the Haredim. The Haredim have pretty much always been important. David Ben-Gurion made them important because he wanted them to bring them into society. They've become larger, as you know, average of 7 children per Haredi family, very well regimented. They don't deviate from the party lines. They don't deviate from Shas and Yadut HaTorah by and large. So that gives them a tremendous strength. Then we've got Yamina Jewish Home, Naftali Bennett, smallish party, probably gets stronger. Yisrael Beitenu we spoke about. All, by the way, in the elections, everyone is staying more or less the same. So we're probably going to another election where the changes will probably be very, very small. So we see Kahol Lavan, essentially the same. Labor and Meretz at that time come to get to the same. And the Arab Joint List, look at this figure of 15. This was a tremendous success for the Arab party. But as you'll see a little later, that's in total crisis at the moment. So what are we seeing now? What is the big picture? This is what's happening tomorrow. So we got Likud Netanyahu, in the top 35, we have 10 women, 1 Druze and 1 Ethiopian. A comment, the fact that we've got 3 or 4 Ethiopians getting into the Knesset is very important. It's quite successful, by the way. They're small, they're 150,000 altogether. Quite a few of them, particularly the elder people, don't vote. So there's been a definite attempt to bring Ethiopians in, and one Ethiopian woman has been particularly successful. Yamina, 4 women. Now, in Israeli politics, where women have been very marginal, women are coming somewhat into a more central position. In politics, we find it in the Supreme Court. Head of the Supreme Court is a woman. By and large, if we take away the Haredim, there's a definite improvement of women in important positions. Obviously, in Shas and Yadut HaTorah, we don't have women. There is a women's section, by the way, of both Shas and Yadut HaTorah who would like to come in. So they're women activists in the Haredi world. In fact, very important. Some of the important potential changes within the Haredi world is going to come from the women, but they've been kept out of politics very carefully. Hatzionut Datit is the big problem. This is, and I don't even like to use what they really are, how far right they are. This is unbelievable. Itamar Ben-Gvir is a Kahanist, and the religious Zionist is made up of 3 small factions. It has the potential of getting 6 or maybe even more seats, but in the top 6 there are 2 women. Hardline, right-wing, homophobic, anti-Arab, very, very problematic, who will almost certainly go into a coalition with Bibi Netanyahu. And that's, if we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but that has some tremendous importance. Then there's Atikva Chadasha, Gidon Sar. He's a break-off member of Likud. He actually was in an internal election in the Likud party. He broke away. There was a democratic election within the Likud, which was important. He broke away, and in the New Hope party of the top 10, there are 4 women. Yisrael Beiteinu, Avigdor Lieberman, top 10, 3 women and 1 Druze. Very interesting. Some of you might remember the Druze, when we speak about the minorities in Israel, so the overwhelming majority, 82% of Muslims, then you have a 7% Druze and a 7% Christian. The Druze are, in many cases, distinctly right-wing. So we find them within Likud and we find them with Yisrael Beiteinu. Just an interesting point is what's in fact happened here. Bennett was very, very close to Bibi for a considerable amount of time. Gideon Sa'ar was very much connected to Bibi and within the Likud. Avigdor Lieberman was very, very close to Bibi. What you have 3 right-wing leaders, all of whom are anti-Bibi at the moment. It doesn't mean they won't go in a coalition, but it says something about Netanyahu, and I'm going to spend quite a lot of time trying to understand what Netanyahu is and how he's been so important. Here you can see the figures. Yesh Latid is doing well on women. Kahol Levan, they're actually doing well as well. We have 5 women. That should be, the figures are incorrect here, but 2 women and 1 Ethiopian. Labor does well with women and Arabs. Meretz does well with women and Arabs. In the joint list, it's obviously Arab, except there's 1 Jewish guy. And here we come to a problem of the Arab world. The United Arab List, RAM, is a break-off Islamist party. So the joint list, which was the hope of the Arabs in this country, the Arabs are 21% of the country, the hope was that if they come together, they will have power. They've got up to 15 seats, and now they're going to go down. It's somewhat, in a strange kind of way, something similar to the Jewish population in the United States, where you have something like 80, 85 or something like that in the Democrat Party, and then you have the rest in the Republican. You have that same kind of phenomenon with the Arabs. The only thing here is that because the Arabs are a marginal group, a group like RAM, United Arab List, can be bought off. And they've basically been bought off by Bibi, okay? He's saying to them, vote for me. Come, if I need you, give me the support I need, and then you're going to get money. And that's really what it is. The vulnerable minority can be pretty easily bought off. So here I just want to take, I think, a very interesting article which appeared in Aris by Alon Pinkas. Alon Pinkas is, I think, one of the best senior diplomats that we've had for a long time. He was the consul general in New York. He's constantly on world television. He's constantly writing articles. And he's really, you know, every now and again when we're looking at journalists, he seems to be one of the journalists where he isn't a journalist in any sense at all. He's writing in newspapers and things, but he's a very, very sophisticated person. And just his comment in the January Haaretz, Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, they are uncanny, similarities in the personality cult status they built. They have essentially declared a war against their own democracy and the despised elites who supposedly control it. So I was obviously watching President Trump closely. And for those of us in Israel who listened to him, and we then heard Bibi, it was almost the same kind of person. But as you can see over here in the red, Netanyahu is much more sophisticated than Donald Trump. So a similar kind of traits, charismatic people. In both cases, Trump only had people around him who he could influence. That was obvious. Netanyahu has exactly the same phenomenon. But in the case of Netanyahu, he's much more sophisticated. Okay. You know, there are people who look at politicians in the world, and there are not a few political scientists who say, Bibi must be one of the most sophisticated politicians in the world. There's some they're not talking about good or bad, but just in terms of knowing how to work the system, he is without doubt the most important. He's very, very sophisticated. He learned his political skills in the United States, and he brought them to Israel at a time when Israeli politicians had no idea whatsoever on how to deal with these kind of things. So Alon Pinkas defines him as an illiberal Democrat. You know, Israelis are calling him a dictator. He's not a dictator, but he's an illiberal Democrat, and that is, and with his skills, that's given him tremendous power. As with the United States, the division of the allies, who the ally groups are and who the enemy groups are, is very, very clear. Our two countries are pretty similar. I mean, more than I would have ever imagined. So if we just quickly look at the allies, the Haredi ultra-Orthodox I mentioned always, 12% of Israeli society receive vast amounts of money. We as citizens do not know how much money they receive because it's given to ministries, it's given to the Ministry of Education, and within the Ministry of Education, they allocate funds for the various subgroups in Israel. So we don't even actually know what it is. We just know it's a tremendous amount. West Bank settlers, he has said he will not move the West Bank settlers out of the territories. In addition, they get tremendous financial backing. If any of you, when you were last in Israel, if you travel through the West Bank, you see those lovely settlements, the lovely, it looks like suburbia, where they're living, and therefore the land has been very cheap and they've been given financial support. Lower income groups, pretty much the United States, look for a charismatic leader. Somehow or other, there's a lot of material on this world global phenomenon. Poorer groups having a rich, powerful leader feel that they can be like that person. So that's really what we're finding here in Israel just as much. By the way, the lower income groups in this up to the elections have been quite violent. There have been a number of attacks on anti-Bibi demonstrators. Not killing, or not one or two people have gotten to hospital, but it's been very, very uncomfortable. Many Israelis want Israel to look and be tough. It's very much, it's also being part of the Middle East. I have to try and understand even the people who I don't agree with. I understand why Bibi for them represents what they want Israel to be. Small country, complex Middle East, United Nations against us, BDS, all those kind of things help to really make Bibi the kind of person who they want. He's also done a great deal in terms of the economy. We've, as you know, we've got a sophisticated middle class. We've got a 70% middle class at the moment. In some ways, our middle class is much more comfortable than yours. You look at the various figures, we're not talking about income, but if you look at what the Israeli middle class person has, which includes affordable health care, very cheap schooling, very cheap universities, if you look at all the benefits, not only the actual income, you'll see that during Netanyahu's period in office, he's altogether been in power for 15 years, Israelis who were not comfortable economically have become. It's obviously not only because of him, it's because we have what I call the top 7%, who are the very, very creative subsection of Israel, and there's been a money down kind of phenomenon. It hasn't only stayed within the top number. He has welcomed the Jews to come home, just in terms of olim, people coming back, people come and live in Israel. The very high percentage of immigrants coming into Israel in the last 20 years have been right-wingers. Those coming from France came because they've in many cases had problems with Muslims. So that even if they were not right-wingers in France, they come to Israel and be France. To be on the right. Sorry, the Russian-speaking people. If you know Russian attitudes towards non-whites and towards Muslims is quite hard line. They come here and they identify with the Israeli right. So we've got a real issue in Israel at the moment when we project where we're going. We don't think Israel per se has moved right, but because we've got these oncoming income groups coming from overseas, who by and large tend to be on the center right or the hard right, that has always influenced the numbers. Many of the immigrants either hate or dislike Arabs, and then you have right-wing nationalist leaders abroad. The whole lot in Poland, in Hungary, in India, in Brazil, we can go on, and certainly in Russia. Those leaders in Bibi have good relationships. So who are the enemies? Very much like we find with Trump. Once again, I'm sure it's resonating. The Attorney General, who was a colleague of Bibi, he was the cabinet secretary, a religious man. Everyone thought that he was going to be swayed by Bibi. He's been unbelievably steadfast. And many people are hoping that what's going to happen in the future is that the legal system they're going to be our savior, because we can see by the election results, or probably what will happen, politics is not going to help us. Bibi's language is also very much conspiracy based, okay? The massive groups who are against him personally, by the way, it's always a very personal attack. They're anarchists and leftists. I mean, this term leftist is such a weird term. Bibi described Lieberman, hardline rightist, as a leftist. So it's a term now, and I think it's very problematic when these terms could get out of control. It means if you disagree with Bibi, you're a leftist, which makes no sense at all. President Rivlin, who's doesn't have all that much political power, but who's a very important symbolic figure. He himself has come out on a number of occasions expressing tremendous fear that the judicial system is under attack. By the way, he is a Likudnik. He got into power, he became president as a declared Likudnik, but he's very, very much afraid of Netanyahu. So, you know, when we look at political parties, we have to realize that even within in a party of 35 members, there's definite tensions over there. George Soros, probably know that very wealthy Hungarian Jew, spends a lot of time in the United States. At a time when George Soros was being attacked in Hungary, and there were terrible anti-Semitic posters in Budapest, Bibi came in against him also, against an important progressive thinker, regardless of whether one agrees with his policies or not. It was a very awkward situation of Soros, who's clearly perceived in Europe as Jewish. You know, that comes up all the time. He puts the fact that Bibi put him into the same category of the enemy kind of weakens Soros in many senses. And I don't have to tell you, he has consistently lied to the Reform and conservative Jews. It's not only women at the wall, it's the whole gambit. And now, by the way, with the recent Supreme Court decision, which is good news, that people who are converted in Israel by the Reform or conservative movements will receive citizenship, Bibi's come out against it. Although he, by the way, and this is the thing I think we always have to remember, he is supported by a significant number of Reform and conservative Jews in the United States. I won't go into all the reasons, but it's very, he gets the support of people who, when they think of themselves as Reform or conservative, you would imagine they would ask questions. But something about him, his I don't know, his charm, his charisma, whatever it is, plays a very important part. By the way, it's difficult for us in the Reform movement because we're finding some of our Reform leaders are obviously very, very supportive of Iraq, but there are other people not directly involved in the Reform movement who are constantly supporting Bibi, who from the perspective of the Reform conservative is certainly not on our side. So why is Bibi likely to get, why is he where he is in politics? So he's been in power now for 12 years. Just let me try and put this in the American sense. Imagine if Donald Trump had been in power for 8 years. I mean, you saw what he did in 4 years. And I'm not saying whether I think he's a wonderful guy or not, but you might know what I think. But be it as it may, just imagine what you can do and what Bibi can do, and he has done in 12 years. He had a previous 3 years in the 1990s. There are so many Israelis who actually say, we cannot even imagine not having Netanyahu as our prime minister, regardless of political views. You know, it's very much the Putin syndrome. If you look at American voting patterns or American language, it's not much of a democracy there. But you have the same kind of phenomenon. If a leader's been in a long time, how can you do without that person? And we've got no control over, your system is much better. He controls national finances. He's the total support of the Haredim. The normalization with the UAE was very successful. Again and again, but it's failed, by the way. You might be following that he's having trouble. He wanted to go to the UAE to be, you know, as an election ploy, but it fell through. We're also having trouble with Jordan at the moment. Vaccinations for the whole country. He got the vaccinations. He wasn't responsible for the giving of the vaccinations because we have affordable health care and the 4 public health systems, which are very, very effective. He's definitely eloquent in his opposition about Iran. Israelis are petrified about Iran, regardless of political views, and he is very much on the global stage in terms of that. He's seen as Mr. Security, but he's not a warmonger. In the 12 years he's been in power, he hasn't been out for wars. We must remember the left of center, in many senses, has been more involved in wars than he has. He talks stuff, but he hasn't got us into wars. The immigrants, I remember, and support of the Arabs. Trump and Jerusalem and Golan Heights, unbelievable. Evangelical support, big stuff. it's very strange. You have right-wing settlers who are very, very exclusive, very Jewish only in their approach, working together with the evangelicals. So strange issue. The major nations of American Republican, the late Sheldon Adelson poured a tremendous amount of money in, a free newspaper for Bibi. You went to the state or the train stations, it was always flowing, always free. People getting a free newspaper would read it. And therefore that had a tremendous amount of effect. A friendship with the world leaders I mentioned. And here comes the famous Bar Ilan speech. I'm sometimes very confused. Sometimes I can't work out things. In the June 2009 Bar Ilan speech, he sounded very much as if he really did believe in the two-state solution. A significant number of American Jews, as many of you know, I've been to America maybe more than 20 times now, and I'm talking about Israeli politics with many people, formally and informally, and they say, but Bibi believes in the two-state solution. When Israelis hear that, they burst out laughing. And I want to be non-politically correct, but the fact that AIPAC still states until today that Bibi Netanyahu believes in the two-state solution, literally when you hear that in Israel, you say, what is going on? What is going on? I'm not criticizing AIPAC. I think they do very important things for Israel. But on this particular point, the 2009 speech was a very, very effective speech for Netanyahu to be perceived as a moderate. That's exactly what happened. Gantz fiasco has strengthened Bibi. There were 3 chiefs of staff heads of the army in the blue and white party. So that's weakened the military factions in Israel. And Bibi is perceived, as we see earlier. And then without doubt, the fact that the country now feels as if there was never coronavirus. Everyone's walking around. Some people have masks. It feels very, very open. We don't know what's going to happen after Pesach, but it's been an excellent election ploy, because people who were wondering who to vote for are saying, wow, we're looking around the world. We're looking at Europe, for example. We're one of the few countries, which isn't totally true because there are a chunk of them, but we're certainly one of the countries where people are walking around and feeling very, very relaxed, as if the coronavirus issue is over. And that's been a tremendous point in Bibi's favor. I won't go through all the scandals. I made a long list of scandals. I think I came to 22. Now, let me say something about scandals. Scandals aren't the things which appear in newspaper articles. We're a small country, and in a place like this, I've been in Israel 53 years. One knows so many people who are in central government positions over the years. I was at the Hebrew University for a number of years, 40 years of Tel Aviv University. You're mixing on a day-to-day basis with people who are advisors and involved in government. So when I have speak about these scandals in a wide range of activities, they're true. What's the problem of Israelis as far as these scandals are concerned? It's a so what kind of comment. And this is what happened when Bibi's been in power for altogether 15 years. He can actually get away with anything he wants again and again and again. There's something that's happening. It appears in the press. He denies it, and within a very short period of time, he actually everyone forgets it. The one that got the best laugh, because in Israeli politics you have to have a sense of humor. Sarah Netanyahu, Bibi's wife, used to take suitcases of dirty clothing to be washed and ironed in Blair House. I mean, when that came out, she used to bring because, obviously when they get on the plane, they don't weigh. There's no weigh in for them. So she was taking these large suitcases so they would be washed and ironed in Blair House. I won't go into what psychologists might say about the Prime Minister's wife, because it won't be nice. What are these elections about? We can see some kind of a sense of what's going on, how the country's feeling. The pro and anti-Bibi issues are very, very strong. This picture that you see in the middle, by the way, is the Prime Minister group. It's called the Black Flag. There's also the Pink Flag. There are about 12 or 15 protest movements. The protests have been unusual this time because they're on the bridges, mainly on Friday and certainly Shabbat on Saturday. There are people on the bridges, and sometimes, for example, very near to the town that we live in. We live north of Tel Aviv, about 20 minutes north of Tel Aviv, in Even Yehuda, on the main pedestrian bridge between our town and the town over the main road, Kfish Arba. You would have up to 70, 80, maybe 100 people on a bridge in the evening. So the anti-group was out there. These elections aren't about left or right, because, for example, Lieberman, who's a hardline rightist, says he won't go in with Bibi. Gideon Saar, who's over here, said that he won't go in with Bibi, but they're both hardline rightists. What's been most unusual is there's almost no mention of the Palestinians. It's one of those unbelievable situations where they just don't exist in Israeli politics at the moment. By the way, they haven't played their politics so cleverly either, but this is certainly the big issue. And what's very much about what's going on in the elections at the moment, of the last few days in particular, is that if any party gets under the threshold of 3.25, if some of you were in Israel many years ago, the threshold was at one time 1% of the total votes cast on election day. Then it went up to 1.5, it went up to 2, and now it's on 3.25. By the way, the reason why this figure was raised to 3.25 was because Lieberman wanted to keep the Arab parties out of politics. He thought they wouldn't get to 3.25, but they came together. And now the problem of 3.25 is certainly for a party like Meretz. Meretz is, it's not quite sure whether they'll get the 3.25. However, because people who might have thought that they might want to vote for Meretz, as soon as they heard in the last few days, very much in particular, that Meretz won't get to the threshold, have moved away from Labour to Meretz, or even from Yesh Atid to Meretz. So from a Meretz perspective, they certainly hope they'll get over the threshold. Only a fool can predict. So I'm going to predict. The problem of the polls is that, let me tell you, something, we're crazy people. Many people answering a poll give the opposite to what they think. Because of that, polls might be fairly correct by people from the left saying, oh, they're voting for the religious Zionists, and religious Zionists saying they're voting for the Arab Party. It's kind of this Israeli thing of, why should I tell the truth? Why are they asking me the question even? So I think American polls are more accurate, but our polls are often based on a few hundred people. In the final analysis, that doesn't really matter what the polls are saying. The question is, what has Bibi got in his hat of tricks? We'll find out tomorrow. He thought he had something, by the way. He thought he would go to the United Arab Emirates. That was going to be a big thing. They were going to meet at the airport in Dubai, and that was going to be fantastic. That fell through. But who knows? We said, and it's true, that he's very clever when it comes to political maneuvering. The lack of ideology makes deviant behavior easier. That means parties can easily go with another party because you don't quite know what ideology is. If you go through the party lists at the moment, you don't actually know what parties think, because every party is wondering how they're going to get into politics, how they're going to get into a coalition. So that's why it's very, very hard to know exactly what a party thinks. There's definitely political exhaustion at the moment, and people are worried that there'll be low voting. Corona fear may keep people away. On election day, it's a national holiday, you get free bus and train tickets. But if you're worried about Corona, you really probably don't want to go on a public bus or a train. Many people obviously don't have automobiles, so that may keep people away. So, most of Israelis, although this is a big election time, are on the beach at the moment, or in a restaurant in Tel Aviv, or during the Chagim at the Western Wall, or demonstrating. So that's what we've been doing for the last few weeks. I want to end on something very unusual. And this was I've been trying for years and years to work out exactly how the population thinks. And we know that from voting patterns. But this particular survey is interesting. In April 2018, the Haaretz went to a broad group of experts from various disciplines of all political views. This is the important point. You hear Haaretz, you know Haaretz is a leftist newspaper, you think they're supposed to be biased. But the group of experts they went to were outstanding. I know many of them. Political scientists, sociologists, economists, international relations experts, you name it. Haaretz did an excellent job. And what they actually did, they asked people to rank the 12 prime ministers we've had in terms of attentive to people, charisma, courage, economics, foreign affairs, honesty, kept promises, luck, place in history, security, social affairs, and vision. So the top were three. David Ben-Gurion, 8.53, 10 is the top. Menachem Begin came second, and Yitzhak Rabin came the third. The reason why those three figures are important is to show that it wasn't a politically biased poll. The experts, I think, did a tremendous amount. Netanyahu got the lowest of all the 12 prime ministers. He did well on charisma, luck, and economics. But when you go to courage, kept promises, place in history, social affairs, and look at honesty, he does terribly. So it doesn't really help in terms of what's going to happen in the election. But I think it's important, and for people like myself, I'm worried about what's happening in Israel, and I don't like the ongoing right-wing successes. And there is rising racism in this country. All the things that worry one, a person who believes in democracy. The judicial system is under attack, terribly under attack. In fact, Bibi is going to have a trial starting just after the elections on three realms, and one of the prosecutor has a guard. There have been cases where Supreme Court judges have had to have guards, which we didn't used to have in the past. So it's going to get ugly when he's up in court. He's going to be in court for 3 days a week. It's going to be quite an issue. So however we look at the actual results, that's one component. But I think it's also important to know that although the anti-Bibi groups might be a minority, they're not a tiny minority. It's how the system is working and how the prime minister has been successful. But I think I would like to say to all of you on watching me now, don't give up on us. As a colleague of mine, Israeli, said, with Trump, we decided not to give up on America. So if I can twist that comment around a little bit, if we didn't give up on America with Trump, we were allies. Please don't give up on us now, because we need your help badly. Okay, over to you, and Ross will field the questions.
All right, just a word. I have flashbacks going back to Wednesdays 20 years ago, and what a delight it is to hear your voice and your analysis. It means
Thank
so
you.
much. So much of what's been happening in the chat has just been, wow, I love what's behind the green curtain. Paul, that's a really nice shirt, great collar, a good color for your skin. I'm joking. Um, the one question that I had, it just struck me how different things are than they were 20 years ago, and yet how much they are the same. When we played the on Wednesdays the politics game, the election game, where everybody had to form the election results came out and we had to form the coalition. I wonder how Wednesday would be different, how you would play that game a little differently, considering back then we were worried about Sharon and it was a very different time. But just on in a few words, what would you do differently this year?
Well, what one of the problems would be, which we didn't have, although you said, Sharon was crucial when you were playing the game. Since Ben Gurion, we've had no prime minister like NETANYAHU. So the problem of the game would be, as it is in Israeli politics, the reality of Israeli politics is so much of what we're talking about is pro-Bibi and anti-Bibi. And it would be a problem when you're trying to educate people about what the real political aspects of society are about. You always come down, and if you played the simulation game now, it would all come down to, do we like Bibi or don't we like Bibi? And that's a problem because, when push comes to shove, by doing that, you miss some of the other components of society. You stop paying attention to the 30% who are in a poverty realm. By the way, I don't think it's as bad as the United States. We have, relatively speaking, very few homeless. But the gap is growing. The gap between the rich and the poor is growing. But so there are many other aspects of Israeli society which I think would be lost in a simulation game because of having a prime minister who's been in power 15 years. So I think that is really how it would be very, very different.
Thank you. A broad question. Friends, there aren't many questions that came up. By the way, just a point of many friends and classmates have conflicts this morning and were not able to join us, and grateful for the recording, but just to know that there will be ripples from this video and
I understand just before Pesach things are busy.
Yeah, indeed. Friends, go ahead and unmute and ask questions. It's
Hey, Paul,
sorry. Okay, David. Yeah.
Hi, nice to see you again. So you mentioned that they raised it to 3.25% because of the joint list. I'm wondering if there's any possibility or appetite for even raising it higher to perhaps 5% to be able to push out the splintering of the small parties that make your elections a regular occurrence in your country.
Yeah. David, there was an interesting thesis that started off the political process in Israel in 1949, and that was we wanted a country which would give all sections of the population an opportunity to be in the Knesset. And that's why it was actually set up. That's why the idea of proportional representation came here. What 5% would do, I think, and that's why I don't think it's going to change, you would bring, for example, let's take Meretz and Labor would go together, but they look at the world differently. So you would have a one party with two very, very distinct factions. And that, in fact, happened with the joint list. The joint list eventually was 4 subgroups, very different one from the other. Between the modern middle-class Arab voter and Ram, the Islamist voters, the gap is tremendous. So they came together, but they couldn't hold together for too long because they have tremendous differences between each other. So, the point that you bring up is very important, and that is, how do we make the system more effective? So there was one attempt, 2 elections, we had a vote for the prime minister and the vote for the party, but it didn't help anyway. There's another system which is constantly being spoken about, but it's very problematic. And that is, in the Knesset of 120 people, 50 would be on the national list and 50 would be in constituencies. kind of looking at the British system as a model. What would happen then, the problem is, how do you divide Israel into 50 constituencies? So the politics of demographic division, you know, it's almost like blowing up the Temple Mount. You know, it is so explosive that, you know, we don't know how it would happen. So, you know, you probably remember Israel's got as many think tanks as the citizen population. So the discussion goes on all the time. There's always stuff. I every now and again sit on one not too far from us. And what we're actually finding is that with all the suggestions, I mean, we've got amazing political scientists in this country, but many of them are saying we actually have not yet found a model which we think would be any better than what we have. There's certain advantages of having 12 parties in the Knesset because it reaches pretty much all the population. So, you know, that's the good part. The trouble is, as you're pointing out, in terms of political reality, it's chaos. So you balance something which seems to be democratic against the reality of political chaos. And, you know, you're throwing up these different balls in the air, and it's kind of hard to know what to do. It's certainly being discussed. I mean, you know, what you're saying is a very valid point.
And just one other follow-up, which is that, and therefore the focus on Bibi's personality more than what the parties are offering. And so that's why people find it easier to just say, look, with Bibi, everything is status quo, and we'll take that over, taking place on something else, especially with the change in presidencies in our country.
Yeah, no, I mean, if we could introduce a system of 8 years maximum, it would be unbelievable. But you can imagine that very few central political leaders would want to do it. They saw what a good time Ben-Gurion had, although when at the end of his career, he was a disaster. They've seen what a good time Bibi's had. So, you know, people who can influence the system would probably not want to do anything which would constrain them. But it's terrible. I mean, it's the Putin model. You know, wherever we look in the world, wherever we see. I mean, Angela Merkel was been in power a long time, but she was a Democrat. So, you know, it's not always bad. But what we're increasingly seeing in the world is that you can't survive in this kind of chaotic situation.
Thank you.
Could I, Paul?
Sorry,
Lisa
had a great. Lisa, can you ask your question?
Sure.
Lisa asked, "How is the?"
I'm sorry, I was with my son. Hi, Paul. It's so good to see you.
Hi. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. My question is actually in relationship to what's going on with the airport right now, and how that closure has affected. I know that there are oftentimes many people that will come in from abroad to vote. So that was, but I have to tell you that the question is quite personal, because my son and I are in Brooklyn right now waiting for the departure of Heller High. And he has been here stuck for 3 months waiting for that departure, and is
okay. So now 3 days ago, the airport was actually opened. So people are actually moving in large numbers. There's still a controlled number on how many can leave. So if you happen to come in to vote, you might find you'll be around for the next election after tomorrow. So this whole system is actually been opened, and it's a political ploy. It was clear that as the election date came closer, everything would be opening up. We're not sure what, I mean, if there's if we have another lockdown, you know, we've had 3 lockdowns. If we have another lockdown, they'll close the airport again. But at the moment, it's actually open. It's not fully open. I'm not quite sure of the restrictions. You know, you also have to have the tests and thing before, but it's better than it was a few weeks ago, which was horrendous.
Right, but when they have been coming in, people have been forced to go into a government lockdown
No, not anymore. Now you get a bracelet. You get a bracelet which controls, you know, sometimes prisoners have been let out of jail are given bracelets so they can be followed. So now that's what happened. When you come into the airport, you given a bracelet on your arm, and that actually means you can be controlled. You can be followed all the time. So you have to stay within your house. By the way, also, even we were overseas last year. We came back just at the beginning of Corona, and we were in lockdown. And the police were following us. It was quite interesting. There were calls on our cell phone every now and again. So they knew exactly where we were. And then we got even a call on our house phone. So, you know, we had to be at home to answer the house phone. So, you know, it was working. But as you pointed out, the government hotels were absolutely chaotic. There were some terrible cases going on there. There was also a rape of a 13-year-old girl. So some terrible things were happening. But it's now the bracelet, which is, I don't like people being followed, but it might be better than the hotels. Thank
Agreed.
you, Lisa.
And Paul, I would love to have a follow-up conversation with you post-election to get your reactions and also to try to get sense of how the results will. Yeah, thank you.
Pleasure. Everyone's interested. So thank you. All the best.
Indeed. Thank you. Les, go ahead.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, Paul. It's good to see you.
Hi. It's good to see you.
I'm just wondering, in terms of elections, do you think there is a possibility that Bibi can pull together this time a solid majority, that everybody will coalesce around him, that even Saar, who's not going to get very many seats, is going to go back to him, and and Yishatid and Bennett and all of them are all going to come in, and then he could get with the religious parties, then he could get a 68, 69 seats.
Les, we never know exactly what's going to happen. You're right in saying Gideon Saar said he'd never go in, and he would in certain situations. I would hope, I mean, one of the things that I would really like to happen would be to get the Haredim out of politics for 4 years. I think that would be number one priority, because they're really causing chaos at the moment. I try to be tolerant on at this point, but I don't manage to be, because that would be great. Look, it's not impossible that your suggestion could come about. It's not impossible. However, let me give you an alternative theory which I've heard about, and everyone in this country has good theories, and that is, it's going to be good if we're going into another election. So we need to have another election. We don't want a stable government, because before the next election, Bibi is going to be up for trial for 3 days a week. And the press is going to be focused on him 24 hours a day. The issues of the court case has been forgotten because there's so many other things going on in Israel. So, you have this other idea that if you have a stable government, what it really means is Bibi with us for another 12 years. So it might seem to be stable, but it's a stable government under this kind of person. So it's not a stable government under, some other characters who work with the sub-parties. We saw what happened with him and Gantz. So, Gantz was there, he did well politically, but he was totally isolated even as the Minister of Defense and some of his other people, Minister of Foreign Affairs and other positions. He was Minister of Foreign Affairs and Deputy Prime Minister, I think. Can't even remember, because these people change roles all the time. So whatever it is, it's this kind of situation of stable government as we see it would be the ongoing control of Bibi Netanyahu on our lives. And I think there's a pretty solid group of 40% of the population, I would imagine, who believe that is the problem, that is the main problem at the moment. And I belong to that particular group. So stable government is a good idea, but Bibi at the head isn't a good idea. That would be my take.
But just as a follow-up, when I talked to some of my Israeli lawyer friends, they said the trial is going to go on for years.
Yeah.
It's going to go on for, there's not going to be any resolution even after with the next
right.
election, right?
Yeah, I don't know if it doesn't have to be so long. I know some of the lawyers are saying it's going to be that. But by the way, there's another part of what we don't yet know, and that it isn't so much what's going to happen on the legal level, but what's going to happen on the Bibi level. You know, if you can imagine this narcissistic kind of fellow turning up in court 3 days a week, having to stand up for the judge, and not being able to say, I have to go out because I've got a very important activity to get involved in. There is also the possibility that he would actually break. People have been saying, you know, if things get too bad and he's really, you know, these people are humiliated in that kind of situation. It's like an impeachment, you know, an ongoing impeachment. So, you know, although what your lawyer friends say, I think is probably correct, from the other side, I don't know if Bibi could really take it for more than a year or two. I think he would collapse. By the way, he could easily leave Israel, sorry, and go to America and be absolutely loved by the billionaires of America. You know, it would be unbelievable for him. And he desperately wants money. He wants to be rich. Money is so important for him. Although he doesn't have his own bank card, but that's something to do with his wife. There's an I won't go into some of the scandals lately, but really he could, I think he could see himself living in another country like the United States and being very happy and very popular, by the way. You know, he'd be a lecturer at Harvard or something like that.
So Paul, I am. We've lost a few folks who have commitments on the hour. But I'd just love to wrap up with one more question. Our world is facing leaders that are getting votes with a show of strength. Trump was all about shows of strength. Bibi for decades has been about shows of strength. When, you know, my year was the year that we were split, and anytime there was a pigua, you said it famous. You know, I had this really good professor of Jewish history, and you said anytime there was a pigua, Israel would go to the right. And it seems that we're stuck on the right with just these shows of strength. And, you know, we've shown perhaps through elections in Georgia, we've shown that, you know, there are ways that those who show compassion rather than strength can be elected. Do you see that happening in Israel anytime soon for the narrative to change?
Yeah, I do think it's possible. You know, I think we're reaching a stage where although the left seems to be weak, and we are weak, the left is weak, there's no doubt about it. But you know, what Israelis want today, if you put politics on the side, what Israelis really want today is to just be comfortable, just be comfortable middle class. The desire for normalcy is so important. And you know, we even let's take an interesting case study because it's related to what you're saying. There was a lot of talk about annexation. Then came the Abraham Accords with the Emirates. And what do we find at that particular moment? We find Israelis gave up the annexation issue, the settlement issue, because there's an agreement between Israel and the UAE that for 3 years there won't be any significant building of settlements. So my point is, and Israelis very, very easily drop stuff. You know, it's a strange situation. They drop. You remember, you know, I remember with the Oslo Accords when things were going well, suddenly things worked out. Or let's even take a better case. When Anwar Sadat arrived in Israel after the 1976 elections, the election where Menachem Begin won, Anwar Sadat, I'll never forget it, came into Jerusalem, a right-wing religious city, with kids lining the streets waving an Egyptian flag. So my point is, and that's why your question is an important one to end on, I am totally committed to a number of cliches. One of the cliches which is relevant at the moment is never say never. And I think the world does change, and one can't always imagine when it's going to happen. But I think there's something very, very wonderful about Israeli society, if we can sometimes put some of this awful political stuff on the side. And I think the growing of a middle-class society, just let me give you one case study. Right-wing Russian voters are apparently moving towards the center. And certainly children of Russian immigrants are more to the center than their parents. That means, you know, if we manage to build a comfortable middle-class society, I think they're going to give up on many of the things. The glory of the army is in decline. It's no longer what it used to be. When you were at HUC, those were the glorious days of everyone must go into a fighting unit. It's not the same now. It's not as though we're pacifists, but things are changing in society, and that's what still gives me hope. Even on the days when 342 days a year, when political hope is limited, my societal hope remains very, very high. And I think that's what you're bringing up, and I think it's an important point, and I actually believe it's possible. I actually believe it's possible. So thanks to all of you. Chag Sameach. You're welcome to contact me. I don't know if you noticed my email address, pliptz@gmail.com. You're welcome to write to me, ask any questions. If you want any material, I'll be happy to send it to you. I'm just the very last comment about myself. I'm having a great time. Coronavirus, which has been awful, has been wonderful for me. Between March and June, I will be giving 35 Zoom lectures, a great deal to my former HUC students, but not only. So I'm having a wonderful busy time, but I would be happy for coronavirus to be over, and I'd love to see human beings again. But
thank you so much. It's a treat to hear your voice, and we can all agree.
Hey.
Khan Yoshev Bachor. We have a dear friend who sits with us, our teacher, our mentor, and I've been pining for this type of update for every election cycle, and every time news comes out about Israel, what would Paul say? And so don't forget, friends, the Moadon is open until 3 today. And then we have Wednesday. Don't forget to bring, it looks like it's going to rain, bring a parka or something. And Rabbi Marmer wants to make sure that you all know that he has office hours. No one's visiting him. He's not sure why. So a real treat and a throwback to our year in Israel. And just thank you all. And Paul, we'll be sending regards from everyone who is not able to make it.
okay. Thank
And
you
I
very
mentioned, I'm not sure how I got invited to this, but when I saw Paul pop up on an email, I signed up.
Great to see you, Les.
And thank you so much,
Everyone
Paul.
stay in good health.
This was very, very, very wonderful. Thank you so much.
Lovely. Thank you so much. All the
Bye,
best.
So
everyone.
Kosi, hey. Just
Apante
one little
man,
chorus.
Kosi, hey, apante man. Kosi, hey, apante man. Kosi, hey, apante man. La palele, pop, pop, pop. La sonalele, pop, pop, pop. La palele, pop, pop, pop. La sonalele, pop, pop, pop. And then it gets faster and faster and faster. Thank you for remembering. I'm pleased I've influenced your careers with Kosi, hey. All the best.
Nice to meet you all.
That was the best.